Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who were centred around three artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais. They were formed in 1848 and they wanted to revolutionise art because they felt they needed to go back to a time before Raphael, hence Pre-Raphaelite. And they were influenced by John Ruskin's writing, who advocated returning to nature, to paint what you see rather than to make it up. That was all over by 1853, the Brotherhood split up, and a further kind of wave of Pre-Raphaelitism came centred around Rossetti and included artists such as Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris. The original idea being taking your inspiration from nature meant that we can recognise the women who are in the paintings. And the most recognisable, of course, is Elizabeth Siddal. She's a good place to start because she is probably what people think of when they think of a Pre-Raphaelite woman. She's got the long red hair, she's very pale. She has what people consider a very doomed, very unhappy, tragic lifestyle. But first of all, she was discovered by a chap called Walter Deverell, who was an artist who knew the Brotherhood, who brought this wonderful woman who he thought was a stunner. He definitely was a stunning woman back to meet the Brotherhood. And she was quickly taken in hand by people like Millais and used in Ophelia, most famously, where she posed in a bathtub, then back to the bathtub with some candles heating the water. And the candles slowly went out. Millais didn't notice it was so engrossed in his work that Lizzie caught a chill, and that led to her ill health, which was to haunt her for the rest of her life and led to her addiction to laudanum.
Yeah.
Now, she also became the mistress, model and muse of Rossetti, and she was his on-off girlfriend, by which I mean she thought it was on, he often thought it was off, and so he would see other people. So Lizzie would have bouts of very ill health when he would then rush back to her side, filled with guilt, and swore off all the other women until they all came back again, until about 1860, when Elizabeth was on her deathbed, and Rossetti rushed to her side and said, "Oh, darling Elizabeth, if only you'd get better, I would marry you." And she got better. Oh, she got better. And he said, "Oh, fabulous, we're married. I swear of all the other women, there'll only be you in my life." And that lasted a year. And so at that point, all the other women came back. And in 1862, Elizabeth's laudanum use got to such a point that she took an overdose. Now, it's debatable whether it was on purpose or whether it's accidental. She took an overdose and she died. Rossetti was absolutely grief-stricken and guilt-stricken, and it was a turning point in his life, and you can see a decline in him from 1862 until he died 20 years later. And he buried his manuscript of poems that he'd written into her, put it in the coffin, and said, "They were for Elizabeth, I wrote them for Elizabeth, and they should be buried with her." And that, again, only lasted a little while, because in 1869 he had her dug back up and the poems back, because he needed them. Now, we tend to remember her for that, unfortunately, rather, even though she was a painter and poet in her own right. But at least she was remembered, unlike my model number 2, Annie Miller. Now, Annie Miller is Holman Hunt's attempt to find a stunner. He followed this beautiful blonde-haired woman home one afternoon, thinking she was some Italian princess or some beautiful Italian woman, but actually she was the fee-ridden daughter of a Chelsea pensioner who was going home to her slum pub. Now, Holman Hunt thought that he would be like Pygmalion, and he would transform this woman into this beautiful lady. And so he sent her off for deportment lessons and elocution lessons, and taught her how to read and write. And then he went off to the Holy Lands, leaving her with strict instructions that she must keep up her studies, and she must only sit for a prescribed list of artists. Now, not on that list was Rossetti, because Holman Hunt was no fool. But as soon as Holman Hunt had gone off to the Holy Lands, Annie Miller went and sat for Rossetti, and if the rumours were true, went and sat on Rossetti. Holman Hunt came back from the Holy Lands. He took one look at the pictures, and off was the engagement. He wasn't having any of it, and scrubbed Annie's face out of all the paintings that he'd done of them. So the most famous picture we have of Annie Miller that isn't Annie Miller is the Awakening Conscience, which is a booklet, when it's meant to be a mistress rising from the lap of her married lover and hearing a knock on the door, which is actually Jesus, and seeing enlightenment. Now, the original picture, she's looking horrified because she thinks, "Oh, Jesus has caught me, I'm doomed." But he couldn't sell that picture, and so he, scraped off the face and then changed the expression of the model to, "Oh, Jesus is here, I am saved." So Annie, though, she did all right for herself, because she married Captain Thomas Thompson and lived a long and happy life in Shoreham by Sea. And it's slightly unusual unusual for a Pre-Raphaelite woman to actually escape from the clutches of the Pre-Raphaelite circle unscathed. It's unlike our next lady, who is my favourite, of course, Fanny Cornforth. Now, I had to write my notes very carefully on my card because I could talk for weeks on Fanny, so I will try and keep this as short. So poor old Fanny. She is the most notorious and the most misrepresented of all the Pre-Raphaelite women. She is most known as an illiterate Cockney prostitute who spat nuts. Well, no, she was a girl from West Sussex. She could read and write, and nobody can break a walnut between their teeth. I'm sorry, it's just not the case. She was discovered by Rossetti while walking in Creagh-Osborne Gardens with her aunt, and rushed up behind her and pulled all the pins out of her hair. And when she turned round, she said, "I just want to see how beautiful your hair is." And she was quite charmed by this, which I think tells you something about Fanny. It was a bit of a game girl. So she went back to his studio and never left. She was his model from about 1859 to 1865, and it's her face in his oil paintings of that period, the Head and Shoulders pictures. And in 1865, Rossetti got a patron who found Fanny's face to be too commonplace, not special enough. And so he was painting Venus Verticalli at the time. And so he decided he wasn't going to use Fanny anymore, and he switched his allegiance to another model. Now, Fanny wasn't having this. She wasn't going to be discarded, and so she became his housekeeper. She became his companion, and they just stayed together like a married couple, but without the married bit, because they liked each other. And his family loathed her because she was common and she was a little bit honest about things, and so they tried to get rid of her. And towards the end of Rossetti's life, his family swooped in and took him off to Birchington-on-Sea and wouldn't tell Fanny where he'd gone. And she was desperate to see him because she knew he was ill. And when the moment that Fanny found out that Rossetti had died was when she read his death notice in the paper. And she wrote to the family and said, "I must come to the funeral, I have to say goodbye." And they waited until the coffin had been sealed and it was the morning of the funeral to reply. So they knew that she would never make it in time to go to the funeral. Now, Fanny had battles with the family after that point, but managed to live a fairly normal life. Of course, had never married a man in time to have children and was alone because her step-family all predeceased her. And Fanny became a woman on her own in old age, which is a very dangerous thing to be in Victorian and Edwardian England. And as we now know, she ended her days in Graylingwell Asylum in West Sussex. When you read the notes that come with the Graylingwell case study, she isn't mad, she's just difficult and loud, basically. But within, within the asylum, she died at the inn. Now, her life is a very interesting contrast to Jane Morris, who is the other very famous face in Rossetti's art. And they're very, very similar people, although their destinies turned out completely different. Jane was a stable hand who came from Oxford and was discovered by Rossetti when she was at the theatre with her sister. Now, Rossetti was in Oxford painting the murals at the debating chambers. When Rossetti had the call from Elizabeth Siddal when Elizabeth Siddal was ill, he rushed back and he abandoned Jane, who thought that she was onto a winner with him. But William Morris stepped in and declared his love for her, and so she married him. And he installed her like a queen in these beautiful arts and craft houses he designed and had built for her. And they had two daughters, Jenny and May. Rossetti returned to their lives in 1865 after Elizabeth Siddal's death, and when his own mental health was beginning to slip a little, and he began to use Jane obsessively in his art. And they began what is supposed to be an affair, but it is up to debate exactly how far the affair went. So I've called it an inappropriate extramarital attachment, because Rossetti was ill most of the time they were together and wasn't physically capable of having a full affair. But whatever. He had swellings on his testicles.
Because of all women.
Yes, I wouldn't like to think. I was at a talk I gave on Fanny, and I was talking about this, and
I asked you to bring that up.
It's so funny because the audience went into this mass discussion of exactly how swollen things had to be in order. I was like, oh, and going back to the art.
Why were they swollen?
It's a common thing, hydrocele, where you get a water gathering on a part of the anatomy, and that's the part of the anatomy you got it on, unfortunate for him. And so he was constantly having it drained, and I'm so sorry. I'll move on swiftly. Anyway, Rossetti himself started using an opiate chloral, and his use of chloral changed his behaviour, became very paranoid. And in 1874, Jane Norris broke off the relationship they had because she was worried about the effects of his moods on her children. And so she was reconciled with her husband toward the end of her husband's life, and they began to appreciate each other. He always loved her unconditionally and let her have whatever she wanted, but she began to appreciate that, you know, he was a good man, and so spent the rest of her life with her two daughters, although May, her eldest, May was the eldest? May, I think, was the eldest, got married, but that was a complete disaster, and so she ended up back at home with her mum and her sister, and lived out her life in Kelmscott Manor, which is a beautiful place in the Cotswolds.
Yes.
Now, when you talk about Pre-Raphaelite women, that tends to be about it. However, there is one other woman who is amazingly important, but we know very little about her, which is Alexa Wilding. Now, Alexa's a very mysterious woman. All we know about her is what Rossetti kind of tells us in his letters and things like that. When we know that Rossetti literally abducted her off the street, that he was crazed because he had to find this new model because his patron didn't like Fanny's face and things. And he saw this beautiful woman on the street, and so he just grabbed her into the coach and took her off to a studio. Now, he offered her £1 a week to pose for him, and so she wasn't too badly upset by this. But his main reason to offer her £1 a week, whether he used her or not that week, was so that nobody else could use her, because he was paranoid that Millet especially would use Alexa Wilding. We don't know a lot about how she managed things. We are told in Rossetti's letters that she was ill a lot of the time. Now, Rossetti is constantly complaining, oh, Alexa's gone off for a month and I don't know if she's ill, she's just unreliable. When actually, if we look at the records, she's off giving birth. We don't know if she ever got married. We know that she had 3 children and she owned her own house. Again, we don't know where she got the money from. But Alexa's life is a complete mystery because she never left her side of the story. And it's wonderful to speculate exactly who in the circle of men was keeping Alexa. She sadly died very young, only 2 years after Rossetti. She died in 1884 of something very trivial by today's standards. And her children moved to South Africa, where the family still lives. And when I wrote my novel, Alexa Wilding, the family got in touch with me, which was lovely. But being tactful, they can't tell you any of the information they have because they've signed an agreement with some other researchers, and so Alexa is at the moment a closed book to us, but hopefully at some point we will know more about her life. Now,
I recognise this from your computer background.
Thank you, darling, that's very kind. Okay, back to the Pre-Raphaelite women. I should give you the honourable mentions. We have Effie Gray Ruskin Millet. Now, Effie is now very famous at the moment as the erstwhile wife of the frigid genius John Ruskin, who was saved from her sexless marriage by the hot John Millet, and well, he was painting her husband, but she is seen as she was a Pre-Raphaelite muse very briefly before Millet married her, and she's the subject of much discussion. Her marriage is endlessly discussed in paper and now on film. We know that she found happiness and wealth and children with Millet, which is a good thing, but she was not received at court until it was Millet's dying wish that she be so, because she was seen as a woman of scandal even at that point. Similarly, the wives of William Holman Hunt, Fanny and Edith Wall. Now, Holman Hunt married Fanny first after the debacle with Annie Miller, and she was expecting his first child when he decided they should all go off to the Holy Land again because he needed to paint something baby. And they got as far as Florence before she had to give birth, and she sadly died shortly afterwards. Holman Hunt returned back with his son and later married her sister Edith. Now, you couldn't do that at the time. You couldn't marry your sister-in-law, and so they had to go to Switzerland, and it caused a big rift in the family, as the third sister Alice was actually married to one of the other original brothers, a chap called Thomas Walner, who was a sculptor, and it caused big trouble in the family. But as far as we know, the Holman Hunts were very happily married, and he remained a Pre-Raphaelite right to the very end. The last painting he was doing was The Lady of Shalott, a giant oil canvas of an illustration he'd done back in the 1850s. I'll move on to possibly the most tempestuous of the Pre-Raphaelite women, Maria Zam-Baker, who was an artist and sculptor in her own right, but she is more famous as Burne-Jones's erstwhile and very tempestuous mistress. She was unpredictable as she was beautiful, and there is a terrible story of how when Burne-Jones tried to break it off, she said, "I'm going to throw myself into the Thames." And so he had to grab her back from the bank, and they ended up rolling around on the pavement, and the police were called, and there was a massive scandal. And she was known as this beautiful but dangerous woman. And she was part of the Greek community who became patrons of the Pre-Raphaelites in the 1870s. And my final Pre-Raphaelite lady is Maria Spartelli-Stillman, another one of the daughters of the Greek community, also an artist who studied under Ford Madox Brown, who was a friend to the Pre-Raphaelites. She modelled for Rossetti, Spencer Stanhope, Burne-Jones, Whistler, as well as Julia Margaret Cameron here on the island. And her family would holiday here in the summers from London because her father could grow grapes here, which he apparently liked to do. So it seems right to end with a woman who has local connections. There are many other models and muses, and some of whom we know a little about, and some of whom we just don't know who they are as yet. But we continue to find out more and more every year, and helping to illuminate the lives of these women whose faces we're all so familiar with. And in the back of the pamphlet, I've given a suggested reading list. If you want to know more, I especially recommend Jan Marsh's book, because that's where I started. And that's what gave me the passion to find out more about these women. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.